Greetings everyone, this is Umby here, and I know it's been a minute, but we are back with another season of the VGC Draft League. It's the same group that I participated with last time, but we're here in Season 2 with Scarlet and Violet, starting with Series 1 of course. Now, there are 16 groups in total, and this time I got grouped into group number 5, alongside L-Trim, Darkbadger, KeystoneRecords, Quaylectra, TreeDolphin, Ryu, and Whatshamidt. Now, if you haven't seen the previous videos from the previous season that I did, or if you're just unfamiliar with a draft league in general, basically once you're sorted out into a group, each player within the group takes turns selecting a Pokemon from the pool of available Pokemon in the game. Once they've selected that Pokemon, it's unavailable to be picked up by any of the other players within that group. Each draft league is different. They'll have different restrictions and requirements as how you build your draft. In this case, we all have to select exactly 11 Pokemon. Each Pokemon is going to be from a different tier. So you can see here the way that it pans out. Each player has to have a tier 1 Pokemon, 2 tier 2 Pokemon, 3 tier 3 Pokemon, 3 tier 4 Pokemon, and 2 tier 5 Pokemon. They're sorted out within this list that we have for reference, and they're kind of separated based off of their projected strengths and utility. So obviously you have things like Amoonguss, Garchomp, and Hydreigon topping off at tier 1, and then at the lower ends, things that you rarely see used like Alomomola, Alomomola, say that 5 times fast, Muck, Winkalone, things of that nature, right? What this ends up doing is, because you have to have such unique picks, there are some things from the lower end of the spectrum that you may not have thought to use before that may end up being a cool utility based on whatever matchup that you're running into. Because what happens is we play every player once, one matchup per week over the course of 7 weeks. And once you selected your Pokemon, you're allowed to make trades and whatnot, but once you have those Pokemon set, you're not locked into any particular moveset or ability each week. You can kind of cater your team, including the 6 Pokemon that you bring, based on the matchup that you're running into. But we can kind of get into that as we get into the purpose of this video. Normally, I do like a breakdown of my draft alone. Kind of the strategies that I'm looking into. I did that last time when I went to the playoffs for season 1. This time what I wanted to do was take my group, number 5, and give my perspective and opinions on and break down each of my opponent's drafts and kind of create a ranking based off of that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. Alright, so a couple of things to kind of get out of the way. First off, I apologize for just dealing with spreadsheets, but we're not going to try and make this look fancy. What you see is what you get. Number 2, regardless of how I rank these teams, this is not indicative of how I think each team will end in the season. Obviously, player skill is going to factor into that each week. I'm just doing an analysis based off of what I see in front of me. And to that effect, what I'm looking mostly for is, number 1, how well can the core strategy, if there is one, operate? Like, how easy is it to do so? And number 2, how flexible is the team? Like I mentioned earlier, the matchups are going to change each week, and each player is not necessarily locked into one strategy over the other. So the more flexible you can be with your Pokemon, the greater chances of your success. If you have a balance between the two, I tend to rate those a bit highly. In this case, we're starting off with what I think is on the lower end of the spectrum, and that is TreeDolphin's selection. Now, if you look at the first 2 Pokemon, these are ordered based off of the tiers. So tier 1 starting out at Meowscarada, tier 2 being the Palafin and Sableye, then moving on down, right? I think that combination of the Meowscarada Palafin is actually fairly strong. Like, Meowscarada could do potentially really well in this draft. It's one of the faster Pokemon available, and at this point, Anything like a Dragapult has not been picked up, and even if it were, that's only one matchup that you're going to run into it, right? So it's not going to find too much that's going to outspeed it without the help of like Priority Tailwind or Choice Scarf. So it's set to put a lot of pressure on Pokemon immediately, but where it shines is when Palafin can put pressure on opposing fire types. I think a lot of them, like, let's say for example Volcarona is kind of incentivized to use like Terra Water or Terra Grass. If it uses Terra Grass, now it's exposed to the knockoff. If it uses Terra Water for whatever reason, like if it's defending against the Palafin, for example, now it's exposed to the Flower Trick. So once Palafin actually gets set up into hero form and put next to Meowscarada, I think it has, like, if you can get a good mid to late game transition, it puts a lot of pressure on the opponent to kind of react, and maybe even difficult to defend because of the amount of damage that they can output. Now, with that though, because I see this as more of like a transitional strength, like from I don't see it just immediately going from turn one in the early game and transitioning into a win. I see this as more like, okay, you start off with Meowscarada, and you may switch out and then end with Meowscarada Palafin, just as an example. So I think that the early game is where this kind of squad can struggle a little bit, because there's not a ton that it's doing proactively. It's kind of just trying to get damage across the board, with let's say for example Toxtricity plus Sableye, Toxtricity plus Telepathy from Rapska. It can, for example, toss out Terra Normal Boom Burst and try and get a ton of damage really quickly onto both Pokemon. Even using Sableye's Quash or Rapska's Trick Room to help get a bit of a speed of advantage over the opponent in order to do so. I think pulling that off though is fairly difficult without being able to set up for the appropriate speed control, because ideally, let's say that you want to go for a trick room approach to that strategy, you're going to need the Rapska, and you don't really have a redirection or fake out to make that to make it safe, is what I'm getting at. I think there are a number of pieces where if you get the trick room off, you're in a pretty decent position, like the Bisharp, perhaps with Eviolite is well positioned under trick room. Sableye with Prankster works well. Rapska itself is slow enough to use the trick room. Even Toadscool to an extent. I think it's a tough sell, but it can even work there under trick room too. But yeah, I think overall the cohesiveness of the team, like, it's not doing a lot defensively. You have a frail grass water fire core. Even Camerupt is not all that bulky, and it doesn't resist ice, which I think can be a major problem versus certain teams, right? So it's kind of wanting to it wants to be a mid to late game team, I think, because of Meowscarada Palafin. I think the early game is where it suffers because it's hard to get that speed control and really get damaged out on the board unless you're using those two to a great effect. And trying to pivot between your other pieces when you're not really all that sound defensively, I think makes the team look a little bit lacking. That being said, I have a lot of faith in those first two. Again, Meowscarada Palafin, so it may end up surprising some teams. I do want to see what it looks like when it's in action. Number 7 on my list is Darkbadger's squad. Now this one is a little bit sneaky. If you're not familiar with it, you can see the Volcarona and Oricorio pairing. And just for reference, the Oricorio, while by standard it's the fire flying version, you're not locked into just using fire. You can go with the electric, or you can use the ghost, whichever version that you want when you have Oricorio selected. But if you're not familiar, Volcarona and Oricorio pair up with the use of Quiver Dance and Fiery Dance being copied by Oricorio's Dancer ability. It itself even has Quiver Dance, so both Pokemon are stacking up their speed and special attack, and then like essentially you can get 3 moves off in the same turn, which leads to a ton of damage through potentially 3 moves on the second turn through the use of Fiery Dance. right? So if you don't know how to approach that, especially with terrestrialization being a factor in the match, you could actually get rolled very quick, just by not being prepared for that. That being said, once you move past that, I think the team struggles a little bit. Um, there are pieces that you can see from it wanting to use Trick Room. You see Hatterene, you see King Gambit, you see Mudsdale, you see Crabominable. And while some of these, like Hatterene and King Gambit, are definitely respectable, but there's not really a safe way to set up the Hatterene because you don't have that redirection, and you're kind of forced to use Fake Out from Morgrim almost just to try and make it safe. And when you do that, you're losing out on being able to use one of those other three potential Trick Room on Mudsdale, Crabominable, or King Gambit, which may be a reasonable sacrifice, especially since Morgrim still has like prankster utility outside of helping out with that Fake Out, right? But if all that falls apart, defensively the team isn't really amazingly sound, right? Like you don't have a grass water fire core to help you pivot. You've only got this. You do have a steel fairy dragon core, but Haxorus is relatively frail as well. Got a very low HP stat. Hatterene, while it has a high special defense stat, also has a low HP stat. So you're kind of relying on the bulk of King Gambit and possibly even the screens from Morgrim to make sure that you're defensively set up if your main offensive threats aren't able to get the job done. But that being said, I do think that Volcaron and King Gambit, just on their own, are like self-sufficient and strong. So if you get a good position with them, I think like in the mid game they can do fairly well. King Gambit here can actually opt for Supreme Overlord instead of Defiant. Because of the way draft leagues work, you can only pick one Pokemon one time. You're gonna see less Intimidates coming out for Defiant to be activated. So at least with Supreme Overlord, when you save it for the late game, you can almost guarantee that you'll have at least some type of boost to increase its damage output. Because like compare it to the other tier 1 selections, it doesn't put on this immediate kind of pressure. It's just a good Pokemon. It would just be a crime to put it in a lower tier, that's all. Also of note is I think Jumpluff could be a sleeper pick for the team. Tailwind may go underutilized because there aren't a lot of Pokemon in this lineup that can make great use of the Tailwind. But you can kind of keep an eye out on Haxorus, which it gets Earthquake. So you can kind of like mimic a typical like Talonflame plus Garchomp type of strategy in that way. But yeah, there are a number of angles that you can kind of approach it from, but I think the soundness, like defensively, as far as like how reliable the setups are, is a little bit shaky. So I rank this one a little bit lower as well. At number 6, I have Whatshamidt's team. Let me know if I'm mispronouncing that. This is the first time I've tried to pronounce it out loud. And I think this one is a little bit weird. I can kind of see some of the way they're trying to approach this draft, but I also think it has a number of flaws that can't be like overlooked. So immediately you see Titan and Abomasnow. There's immediate synergy there through the Slush Rush and just by Snow increasing its bulk overall. You can even see Glaceon also getting the same benefits from the Snow by virtue of being an Ice type. So what ends up happening is these Pokemon are all incredibly bulky and maybe tougher to remove. On the defensive side, the issue that they may run into, however, is a lot of the teams that were selected in this draft lean closer towards the special offensive side of things, which may it essentially makes the defensive stat boost that they're getting a little bit wasted. So you're kind of having to augment that through the use of Assault Vest and Aurora Veil from the Abomasnow, or even potentially the Glaceon if need be. and that can get tricky to set up because you don't really have the speed advantage as a Abomasnow to get the Aurora Veil up. Even if you do have the bulk to maybe sustain an attack or two, or if you have the focus sash attached to it, right? Additionally, it's the weaknesses of the team is a little bit weird. Like there's a lot of fire weakness. Amoonguss, Titan, Abomasnow, Glaceon, and Orthworm, all weak to fire. Now, granted, you can use Terrestrialization to help out with that. You can use Terra Water. The Tauros fire version is on the team to resist the fire moves. Even Houndoom gets Flash Fire to help out. Also, want to make sure I don't overlook it. The Knackle Stack is a cheeky little pickup to help defend against that as well. But once you create a whole cohesive squad, though, it is hard to keep multiple fire weaknesses on the same team, I believe. Also, almost forgot Magnezone there, another steel type, because you're not going to be able to defend against them all, defend for them all, right? But that being said, I still think that there's relevant resistances and immunities to the fire to help out with that a little bit, so it creates somewhat of a balance there. Last but not least, I want to point out the Flamigo is sitting there. So Titan, as we should all know, gets the belly drum, and there are multiple ways. I'm not going to pinpoint them out. It should be apparent from what's on the screen. There are a couple of ways to try and safely get the belly drum off with the Titan, and assuming that you get that, Flamigo is then going to be in position to copy the stat, the stat boost from the belly drum, which could create a little bit of a problem, a little cheeky strategy there. Now, while I don't think lowly of this team, I think it is difficult to pull off like the perfect setup into most of the teams here. Most teams are already going to be sufficiently strong just straight up out the gate and put on their pressure immediately, where I think this team kind of wants an extra turn to set up first, and then it gets its main offense on the board. And I think being behind a step could be like a downfall in a particular matchup. But who knows? Once again, it's going to come down to like the actual match itself, seeing it in practice. But just on paper, I think it's a very difficult team to use. So that's why I ranked this one a little bit lower. At number 5, I have Quaylectra's squad. Again, let me know if I'm mispronouncing that. And they're opting, or up front, it looks like they're opting for a bit of a Sunroom strategy. We can see immediately Torkoal and Oranguru. I think that strategy in Series 1 has been a little bit awkward. There was a lot of projection that because of Terrestrialization, Torkoal do a lot better than it ended up performing across the board as far as like tournaments online and even the ladder itself. It looked like it would be like particularly strong because Terra, Fire, Undersun, Eruption would just blow everything up, and it just ended up not being the case. Here in the Draft League, it may have a little bit more room to operate, particularly next to the Oranguru. It gets the Instruct to spam the Eruption even more frequently, and if it gets set up, it could quickly run away with the game. That being said, I think the setup into that it can be a little bit tricky, because if you want safely to get the Trick Room down, typically you're gonna want the mouse hold for redirection, or even the Raichu for fake out pressure. But then now you have to pivot the Torkoal back in, which is definitely doable. Torkoal, Oranguru, mouse hold could work to serve that strategy, but it's a lot of effort to get that Torkoal set up. So if it doesn't immediately pop off and win the game, there could be a little bit of a struggle. Now that's what the Sco villain, their chosen chlorophyll user, is to potentially help to mitigate, so that you're not immediately forced to go into a Trick Room mode, or you can save it for later. You can use the pressure of Sco villain's offense immediately off the bat, getting the double speed from chlorophyll, and get your damage on down that way. You can even kind of mix it up, do like your Trick Room early and then save Sco villain for late game once the Trick Room is down. I think there are multiple ways to kind of like attack that particular strategy. Now aside from that, Colossal is kind of sneaking its way into the back of my mind. I can see it next to the Golduck with Aqua Jet to proc the Steam Engine and weakness policy, you know, similar to how it worked in Sword and Shield, just without the Gigantamax and Max Volcalith, fortunately. But again, you can kind of cater the team the way that you want to, depending on the matchup for the week. There are a couple of other strategies that I'm thinking of that could work out, just to kind of speak to the flexibility of the team. But similar to like Whatshamidt's team, I think it's a hard team to execute the core strategy. And even with some of the flexible ways that you can, you know, kind of lean into strategy, I think that's difficult to execute too. Because let's say that Torkoal is just like not optimal as your trick room, your main trick room offensive strategy. You don't really have a lot behind that to really take advantage of. You have Colossal, which ideally does want like a weakness policy proc to, because it's not inherently really strong. Spiritomb, while is annoying Pokemon, is not particularly strong as well to really take advantage of the trick room. Even Palisand, at base 100 special attack, while respectable, is not enough to, you know, start steamrolling teams when you're trying to be proactive. So there's a lot going into the Torkoal basket. And I think a lot of the success is going to rely on how well Quaylectra can actually position and set up that trick room, or otherwise use Scovillain to set this hone outside of trick room. Next up, I've ranked my team at number 4. Now, I was kind of torn on whether or not I want to go ahead and rank my own team amongst the rest of my peers here. But just like, I'm trying to look at it as objectively as possible, even though there's like a little bit of bias. And I think mine came around to the middle of the pack. As the first pick in the draft, I just had to go for the Goldingo. While my overall strategy initially was different from what I ended up with, I just felt like that had to be a priority pick. It's such a good Pokemon, even outside of the draft league, that inside I feel like it could be potentially much stronger. From there, I wanted to make the team as easy to operate as possible, so went for the Noivern just so I can set up Tailwind. Similar to, it's going to operate similar to how like a Hydreigon and Goldingo work together. And then still I want to show up at least a little bit defensively with a Fire Water Grass Core. So Rotom, Heat, and Gastrodon I think is an excellent pairing to help defend against each other's weaknesses. And while I wanted a different grass type, I was able to, the only thing that I could really choose was Tropius, which is not the worst pick that I could have gotten. It also gets access to Tailwind. It's also going to be my only wide guard user for the time being. So it can be pretty bulky. It helps me address other like opposing grass types. So I'm looking forward to like kind of soak up hits and then launch off its own air slashes into let's like Meowscarada, for example. It's gonna still struggle a little bit being a flying type itself, but overall I think that's gonna be fine for now. And lastly, just to give my team a little bit of physical punch, I was able to pick up the Sand Duo, Lycanroc and Hippowdon. I think that's going to be important, particularly not only to like diversify my damage, but also I think Weather Wars is going to be a real thing. Like each different type of weather, automatic weather setter has been picked up by another person in this group. Being that my sand setter is Hippowdon, is going to be like the second slowest weather setter that we have available. I have more of an opportunity to underspeed the rest of them and keep that control for myself. So while I'm not fully happy with the way that this team panned out, I think it has like its inherent issues. I think overall I did decently to create balance across the board, while still maintaining like a strong offensive presence. Obviously not the worst, but I think a bit far from the best. I could even rank it like one spot lower, but I feel pretty confident that it's like just above middle of the pack in my opinion. But again, A little bit of bias from my end, since I know how I want to operate my team. If you think differently, definitely feel free to leave a comment below. All right, number 3 is where we start hitting really well-rounded drafts and, you know, carefully crafted strategies. And I think Keystone Records did really well with this one. Like, I actually love how bulky and diversified the overall team is. Like just between Garganackle, Skeledirge, like the initial 4 picks that you see on the screen are already solid enough. That's your Grass, Water, Fire core, plus the amazing like defensive utility of Garganackle. Going down the list, Corviknight, Umbreon, obviously my namesake, is one of my favorite mons, so I kind of keep a careful eye on that. And Corviknight's actually one of my favorite Pokemon too, so love to see that there. And they're really bulky, and still provide like a lot of utility at the same time. Clodsire further adding on to the bulk. And then lastly, Espeon. I think it's going to be an interesting Pokemon to keep an eye on, because it's got access to a lot of utility through like Light Screen Reflect. It can be a potential Trick Room setter, which will help augment some of these slower, bulkier types a little bit, if they want to be a little bit more proactive. All throughout this draft, like even the Ampharos, I'm kind of keeping an eye on, because they're all so bulky. Kind of help control the pace of the game. Like, I don't think anything is going to immediately steamroll this team, and it has opportunities to kind of like just chip away at the opponent if they don't have like an immediate way to set up like their offense and just go ham. Even if they do, like let's say they want to use like Swords Dance or like Throat Spray, Skeledirge and Clodsire having Unaware just makes all that moot. So it just kind of like hard stops them. Now, that being said, I do think because it's not being proactive, if a team is very heavily offensive oriented and could just blow past that without too much setup, I think the team could struggle a little bit. It really ideally wants to be able to sustain as much damage as possible, and if there's just a matchup where it can't do that, that's where I see it falling a little bit short. But the likelihood of that is relatively low, just because it's such a balanced team, in my opinion, that I think it can like address most matchups and do pretty well. Really well done, in my opinion. My number 2 rank is Ryu, and you can kind of immediately see why. It is essentially a full rain squad, just minus a grass type to defend against opposing water types, which you don't really need by virtue of the fact that it has Rotom Wash, right? I think rain was something for Series 1 that took a minute to kind of figure out, but the recent successes, and particularly like the San Diego regional, where rain got 3rd place, seemed like it was around that time where the appropriate rain squads got figured out. So that's essentially, of course, Pelipper for your automatic rain setter, your main water attacker, which was Palafin for the main team outside of this draft league, but opting for Floatzel here just because of availability, and then either Dragonite or Salamence. In this case, Ryu opted for Dragonite. What it does is provides stab hurricanes, much stronger than what Pelipper offers, again, to deal with opposing grass types. And then you also have the flexibility of either running like the special version of Dragonite with Hurricane, or opting for a physical version with perhaps Extreme Speed, for example, a pretty popular and common set. But it doesn't stop there. Tinkaton, while I am not really a fan and don't have a high opinion of this Pokemon like in a vacuum, on this particular squad in rain within a draft league, I think it's positioned really well. The speed tiers start to get skewed when you're in a structure like this, which means Tinkaton is very likely going to outrun a lot of the things that it comes up against, and with that, it has a lot of strengths and utility. Everyone loves how high powered the Gigaton Hammer is, and paired with Stab, it's set to do a lot of damage to most of the threats, because like outside of outside of like the really bulkier teams like Keystone Records, most teams may feel pressured by the Gigaton Hammer alone. But then outside of that, you have things like Thunderwave, Helping Hand, Knockoff, Fake Out, all really valuable tools that it can toss out that serves well for a ranged squad, right? Now outside of that, even if you didn't opt for like a ranged strategy, there are some pretty useful tools across the board. You have Salazzle and Sneasel, both with Fake Out and Fake Tears, just like Tinkaton. So you can kind of like be flexible with whether or not you want to use Tinkaton or if you want to use like Salazzle, depending on the matchup. You have Glamora, which, you know, even outside of this draft league can be slept on a little bit. It's got great special attack, and then Rock Poison. While there are a lot of steel types that you have to kind of watch out for, it also gets access to Earth Power to deal with said steel type. So a lot of coverage and utility across from that. And even Toxic Debris can come in clutch a little bit to set up the Toxic Spikes for dealing with the Dondozo squad if they want to save Dondozo for like a late game strategy. Then lastly, I think this cannot be understated. I think Stonejourner was an excellent value pickup, or at least good, if not excellent. This is a tier 5 Pokemon from the list that was provided for us, which means it's often going to go overlooked. But getting access to the Power Spot ability just makes this team like insanely more strong. Like even if you didn't want to lead with Rain, Dragonite with Power Spot, Floatzel, who's already actually pretty fast with Power Spot, becomes that much stronger. Also gets access to Wide Guard to deal with like all the spread moves that are on like a lot of different teams, including like the Torkoal team, right? So I think it's like, for the utility that it provides, even though its special defense is absolutely garbage, I think this is a good value pickup. And overall, this is well-rounded as far as how it wants to pose its offense, and it's hard for it to lose tempo because of the sheer power and speed that it provides. So yeah, that's why I rate this one so very highly. And lastly, but certainly far from least, you can tell why like immediately if you're paying attention. I have Eltrim 24's squad as number 1 in my opinion for our group. Obviously we got the Dondozo Tatsugiri, which in Draft League, outside of Draft League, is obviously just very strong. It makes just for like a self-sufficient strategy to where you only really need to like shore up with 2 Pokemon versus whatever matchup that you need to adjust for in the week. And it itself is really flexible just through the Terra type alone, right? And it's also just really high value when you look at this tier list. Like obviously Dondozo is going to be the tier 1, and then you expect Tatsugiri because it's going to be the common combination, would either be like tier 1 or tier 2. But it's stuck down here in actually tier 3, which means there's not like a lot of pressure to like really force the tier 2 picks, which makes developing the rest of the draft really easier. Case in point, they picked up Talonflame and Sylveon as their tier 2, and I think that's really powerful. Once again, the speed tiers end up being really skewed because there's only going to be 1 copy of any particular Pokemon in the league. So you can potentially run Sylveon fast, and even with Tailwind, like there's not a lot that's going to like speed creep it that normally would. Like you can even run it like mid speed or minimum speed, depending on what matchup that you're running into. And just with the Tailwind from Talonflame, not needing a ton of speed investment, you can still be a bulky Sylveon and still spitting out tons of damage to like modest pixelate Hyper Voice. For any trouble matchups, you can run the Terra Fire as is normal, right? Just those 4 alone, I think, make a strong core. But then it's backed up by a ton of utility through the next 3 Pokemon we speak of: Serena, Vivillon, and Gothorita. Serena, I just love the combination of Talonflame plus Serena. Personally, it protects this Talonflame from Fake Out, to preserve the Gale Wings. That also means that you don't necessarily have to go Covert Cloak if you run the 2 next to each other, or Terra Ghost. You can just use Queenly Majesty, call it a day, right? With Vivillon, I think this is a little bit of a sleeper pick for this league. I kind of equate it to a mini Mousehold, because when we take a look at this and its abilities, right, it gets Shield Dust, Compound Eyes, and Friend Guard, all very useful abilities. Shield Dust, if you're running like a Sage, helps prevent fake outs, but you have Serena for that if you really want to run the two next to each other. Then you have Compound Eyes, and it does get Sleep Powder, so you pretty much have almost 100% accuracy Sleep Powder to throw out. You have things like Rage Powder, Pollen Puff. It does even get Tailwind if you want to use that instead of the Talonflame. Again, just matchup dependent. And then last but not least, Friend Guard. And like I said, I kind of compare this to Mousehold, where Friend Guard has picked up in Series 2 for usage over Technician. So like, really solid utility from that Pokemon alone, even though it's frail and not nearly as fast as Mousehold, right? And then lastly, Gothorita, which with Shadow Tag, if you're looking to position the Dondozo or the Tatsugiri safely, Gothorita is a way that you can do that. Just preventing the switch outs from the opponent and getting fake out pressure in. This could allow like Talonflame or even Sylveon, honestly even like Tatsugiri with maybe Choice Specs or Life Orb to get a KO really quickly on a key counter to the Dondozo if they want to lead that, and then pivot into the Dondozo in a later part of the strategy. Who knows? I think it's really flexible. Just use of Shadow Tag leading off. So yeah, very strong core, very strong offense, very strong utility and support across the board. This was an easy #1 just from Dondozo Tatsugiri alone. If you even had like a decent draft, I think it's high up the list, right? I think Eltrim did really well to draft strong pieces to where even if their main strategy was not self-sufficient, there's a lot of help along the way. And that wraps up my opinion of Group 5's different draft teams. Once again, it doesn't indicate anything as far as what the standings will be, or it doesn't attest to any of the players' skill. This is just everything that's on paper, and I thought it'd be a fun thing to do, to just kind of break down what I see in my opinions of each player's selections. Again, if you want to contest anything that I've said here, or if you see anything that I don't, think someone else would be ranked higher or lower, I'd love to hear about it. Especially within my own group, I'm always down to hear discourse and different opinions. I think it'll create a healthy and strong competitive environment for what we're going here, and lead into a strong playoffs past that as well. That being said, thank you for watching. I'll be going into some coverage of my own matchups. I typically do a breakdown of the week that I'm going into and commentary as the match is going. And this time around, I also think I may go into to the replays for our groups for the week and do commentary over that. We shall see, so just keep an eye out on the channel. Either way, I appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.